Good evening and warm greetings to all of our viewers. Welcome to our event, Climate Emergency and Nuclear War, What Are the Connections? My name is Brennan Tierney. I'm speaking to you from the stolen land of the Nonotuck people, today known as Northampton, Massachusetts. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Nonotuck people, as well as neighboring indigenous nations, including Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and Pecumtuck, knowing full well that this is only one small and incomplete act toward true reconciliation and justice for indigenous people. I work for the Peace Development Fund, a public foundation that builds the capacity of community organizations through grants and trainings. And we are proud to be a co-sponsor of tonight's event alongside a number of great organizations in the Pioneer Valley. I'd like to ask viewers to please submit your questions for our presenters through the chat function on YouTube, which should appear on the right-hand side of your screen. To practice, if you would, please go ahead and type in the chat where you are tuning into this event from so we know who is in the audience. I want to underscore the importance of this conversation. While COVID-19 has captured much of public attention, the global climate emergency we are experiencing and the palpable threat of nuclear war remain two of the most pressing and indeed existential threats facing humanity. And yet, these issues are also connected, as our expert panelists will cover tonight. As a young person deeply concerned with the devastating consequences climate change is already having on this planet, I hope this event raises attention to the related threat of nuclear war, particularly for young people for whom this issue is not as visible. I hope the event serves to inspire and catalyze change for nuclear weapons abolition, global peacekeeping efforts, and bold climate action. Unfortunately, we had some slight technical difficulties getting our moderator for the evening, Melaka Semdani, onto our Zoom account. So we're working to get her on. And she will be helping facilitate the question and answer portion of this event. But for now, we're going to transition right into the panel and have our speakers speak for about 10 minutes each before going into question and answer. So again, please submit your questions through the chat function on YouTube. And without further ado, it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Marty Nathan. Marty, take it away.
Thanks very much, Brennan. My name is Marty Nathan. I live in Northampton. I'm a retired physician who used to work at the north end of Springfield. I'm an activist for immigrant rights. And I'm an activist for immigrant rights and also have been working hard in the struggle against climate change as a founder of both Climate Action Now and also Springfield Climate Justice Coalition. It's a real honor to be here tonight. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the hardworking planners, Melaka, and my fellow panelists who all work so hard around and through and in a pandemic to make this happen. Let's see, I am not, oh dear. All right, guys. There we go. It's coming. Can you see the slideshow now? Great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we had another technical glitch just now. What I presented to this similar panel that occurred 3 years ago, talking about nuclear war and climate change, but so much has changed on the climate front, climate change front, that we have gone from describing the climate emergency as the threat of climate change to now facing the reality of climate change. And that is where I want to focus my attention tonight. Carbon dioxide levels have risen to 415 parts per million from only 280 parts per million pre-industrially. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have formed a thickening blanket around the Earth that allows sunlight in, but prevents much re-radiation of heat into space. The result is global warming, which is, with its chaos, its climate chaos, is crescendoing every day, it seems. The last decade was the hottest ever on record. And in that hottest decade, the 5 hottest years have been the last 5, 2015 through 2019. That heat comes in waves. In the last 6 decades, the number of annual heat waves in 50 US cities has on average tripled. 2019 was a terrible summer. It was 115 degrees in France, and in northern India, some regions suffered temperatures surpassing 113 degrees for the better part of 3 weeks, if you can imagine. Right now, Southern California is suffering a record-breaking heat wave with a recent temperature in Death Valley of 130 degrees and all-time high temps in Los Angeles. With heat comes drought, because higher global temperatures mean more evaporation from the Earth's surface. Here we have a picture of what used to be a reservoir right next to Cape Town. Regions as diverse as California, the Eastern Mediterranean, East Africa, South Africa, as seen here, and Australia have all experienced severe and in some cases unprecedented drought in recent years. With heat and drought come fires. And you probably recognize these pictures. We remember well the Australian fires in just the last year. By January, 46 million acres had been burned, 2,500 homes were destroyed, 34 people were dead, and 1 billion animals were killed. The smoke was choking. As I speak, now there are fires ranging around San Francisco. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the poles. The polar regions are important because they have, what happens there has global impact. In the Arctic, the temperatures are rising more and rising more quickly. This spring, there was a heat wave in Siberia. Tiny, if you can see that, Verkhoyansk, I don't pronounce that very well, made international headlines when it logged a record high temperature of 100.4 degrees in June. And heat makes everything melt. The ice sheets are melting, otherwise known as glaciers. They're melting in both poles. Here we see to the left is the West Antarctic ice sheet collapsing because of the high flow of ice water from underneath it that is causing its collapse. To the right, we see Greenland, and a study just came out a few days ago that Greenland's ice sheet has melted to the point of no return. Here we have pictures of that melting. To the left is a river with rapids. That is the melt coming from a glacier. And to the right is the breaking off of a piece of permafrost and glacier. Glacial melt and water expansion from warming produces sea level rise, which is accelerating in leaps and bounds over time. At this pace, sea level will rise 26 inches by the end of the century, rather than the foot that had been predicted very recently. The result will be earlier and massive coastal flooding, threatening hundreds of millions of people in coastal cities and villages. Oops, sorry. Now, melting sea ice does not cause sea level rise, but it still is important because what color is ice? Ice is white. Loss of that white surface means that instead of being reflected back into space, energy from the sun is absorbed by the dark sea that used to be underneath. More heat means more warming, completely independent of our burning of fossil fuels. This is one of several of the natural feedback loops in the climate change process, ones that are feared because when they happen, things speed up and we can't stop them. Two other feared feedback loops include, like to our left, the burning of Arctic tundra. In the last 2 years, these fires have pumped record amounts and increasing megatonnage of CO2 into the atmosphere to further heat the planet. To our right is even more fearful. In that picture, you see one of the granddaddy feedback loops of all climate lore. These are bubbles of methane rising from what is a freshwater lake that has been formed in a depression created by thawing permafrost in the Arctic. This methane, which is 80 times the greenhouse potency of carbon dioxide, has been stored in that ground for centuries and is now being released to create further climate change. I used to spend all my time just talking about megastorms because they were the biggest thing happening in terms of early climate change. And I always want to remind all of us about Hurricane Maria. Hurricanes and typhoons in the age of climate change exhibit higher wind speeds, more rain, and worsened storm surge, creating more destruction. 3,000 people died from Maria, not just from the storm, but from the neglect that came out of Washington afterwards. The oceans are heating. They're acidifying and deoxygenating, causing coral bleaching and death. Coral reefs support the marine ecology on which much of the world relies, and they are in severe peril. We have to tackle the climate emergency, and the IPCC report of October 2018 gave us our marching orders. It stressed the need to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to maintain biosphere viability, but to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees will take a radical reduction of emissions by 45% by 2030. What's the military got to do with it? First of all, they're polluters. The US military is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum and correspondingly the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. Its emissions equal more than entire industrialized countries such as Sweden, Denmark, and Portugal. This is a picture of a B-52 Stratosphere, one of the big belchers and farters of pollution for the military. And what does the military do? War. What is it good for? It's good to protect the fossil fuel supply. The vast military infrastructure around the world is strategically positioned in oil and research-rich areas and along shipping lanes that keep the fossil fuel economy in operation around the globe. Oil is the leading cause of war. An estimated 1/4 to 1/2 of all interstate wars since 1973 have been linked to oil. And the interplay. Climate change accelerates pre-existing crises in countries around the world, leading to fight or to flight. Fight means war. Climate change makes already precarious social and political conditions worse. According to the 2019 World Peace Index, the effects of climate change pose a major challenge to peace in the coming decade. As climate crisis worsens, more ecological disasters will lead to more regional wars over water, food, and land. Fight or flight. It's commonly estimated that 200 million to 1 billion people will be displaced and forced to migrate by the middle of the century due to climate change and the associated conflicts. Then in this country, when they reach our border, and in many others, they are met with the military. We face stark choices with the possibility at the same time of real opportunity if we choose well, and that choice is to convert military spending to renewable energy and conservation. The Pentagon now monopolizes the funding we need to meaningfully address climate crisis. But the benefits of converting in jobs would be staggering. $1 million spent on conservation or education would produce twice the number of jobs of the same amount given to the Pentagon. Infrastructure and renewable energy investment yields 40% more jobs than the military. Climate change and nuclear war parallels climate change and conventional war. Climate change is a threat multiplier for conflicts that lead to nuclear war for nuclear armed opponents. The competition over fossil fuels again and their transport is a particularly intense source of antagonism. On the other hand, the ongoing maintenance, upgrading, and now testing, as proposed, of nuclear weapons comes out to about $70 billion a year. It's a massive expense that also could be used instead to fund the transition to energy conservation and true renewable energy, solar, wind, and geothermal. What's the answer? We must fund a Green New Deal in great part by cutting military and nuclear weapons spending. To cut emissions as drastically as is needed will take at least $18 trillion over the next 30 years. We need a jump start in the first 5 years of at least $1 trillion per year, then settle down to about $300 billion per year. We could do this if we cut the military in half and eliminate nuclear maintenance by eliminating nuclear weapons. That would come to about $450 billion. Other sources, of course, for funding the Green New Deal would be ending fossil fuel subsidies and elimination of the billionaire tax cuts. But what it would produce would be not just elimination of the threat of runaway climate change, but would be good paying jobs, plus cleaner air, particularly for Black, brown, and low-income communities that are forced to host the fossil fuel infrastructure. Plus, it would stop the killing of war and eliminate the threat of nuclear war. Excuse me, but these are my grandchildren in Guam, and I remember them every time I think about this issue. Thank you.
Dr. Nathan, thank you so much for that very insightful analysis and presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Mahlaka Samdani. I am so sorry for not being able to join you earlier because of a technical glitch at my end. I am so honored to be the moderator for tonight's event. Dr. Nathan, thank you so much for that. I will now turn to our next speaker, who is Dr. Ira Helfand. He is the member of International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which was the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. He is co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and the co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. Dr. Helfand will discuss the consequences of nuclear war and how we can prevent it. Dr. Helfand, please go ahead.
Easier when I'm unmuted. Thank you, Malaka, and thank you, Marty, for that incredibly powerful and compelling presentation. Nuclear war and the climate crisis are viewed as the twin existential threats to human society by many of us who look at these issues. And I think Marty has explained very clearly the incredible devastation that will inevitably happen if climate crisis continues unabated, if we don't do what we need to rein this in. Perhaps the most catastrophic consequence of the climate crisis will be that it may lead to nuclear war. Clearly, as the conditions on this planet deteriorate over coming decades, there will be a marked increase in conflict. And if nuclear weapons are still on the table, the chance they will be used will be greatly increased. But we may not have to wait for the climate crisis to unfold to experience the horrors of a nuclear war, because there are many other circumstances that are also conspiring to drive us in the direction of a nuclear conflict. And Michael Klare will be talking after me about one of these situations in particular, the relationships between the United States and China at this time. What I would like to do is to talk for a few minutes about what is going to happen if there is a nuclear war, and to make the case, I hope, convincingly to you that it is essential at this moment in time that we address the nuclear danger directly, that we take action to eliminate these weapons before they eliminate us. It's a terribly difficult moment we're living in. We are going through the worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We have had horrifying evidence of the ongoing presence of social and economic injustice in this country throughout the course of this year. And we're facing a bizarre political climate and a possible constitutional crisis at the end of the year after the election. But despite all of these challenges, we cannot afford to lose focus on the two threats to our actual existence, the two great existential threats, climate change and nuclear war. Let me talk to you for a little bit about what will happen if we have a nuclear war. And I want to start by discussing a limited nuclear war. We used to think that we only had to worry about a big war between the United States and the Soviet Union. But this was the only threat to humanity as a whole. We have learned over the last decade that even a much more limited nuclear war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, not even involving the great nuclear powers, would be absolutely catastrophic, not just for South Asia, but for the entire planet. The most recent study to look at this question, which was published last September, showed that if India and Pakistan go to war under current conditions, in the first week, 75 to 125 million people will die from the direct effects, from the explosions, from the fires, from the short-term radiation poisoning. But that's only part of the story. The fires that these nuclear weapons cause will put enough soot into the upper atmosphere to trigger an abrupt climate crisis, dropping temperatures across the entire planet, leading to abrupt cooling and a total disruption of global agricultural patterns. And as a result of that, there will be a worldwide famine involving not just South Asia, but the entire planet, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, North America, and Europe, the whole world. And as a result of this famine, up to 2 billion people will be at risk of starvation. An event of this magnitude is unprecedented in human history. A famine which threatened 2 billion people would not mean the extinction of our species, but it would absolutely mean the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to believe that the very fragile economic system on which we all depend would survive a disruption of this sort. This is something that could happen tonight as we are sitting here. It is an immediate, real, and present danger, and we have to take that seriously, and we have to take action. Now, this is a limited nuclear war involving less than 1% of the world's nuclear arsenals. If the United States and Russia get involved in a nuclear conflict, it'll be far worse. And we have to understand, at the end of the Cold War, we thought we never had to think about this again, but we do. The United States and Russia are both engaged in a vast program to modernize their nuclear forces, to make them more usable, more deadly, and they're engaging in nuclear threats of a sort that we did not think we would hear after the Cold War ended. They can conduct military exercises in which they plan the possible use of nuclear weapons. So what happens if that dreaded scenario unfolds? Let me start by describing the effects of a modern attack on a single city. Many of us have in our minds, especially after the recent Hiroshima and Nagasaki anniversary, images of what happened to those cities in 1945, and they are powerful reminders of what nuclear weapons can do. But the most important thing we need to understand about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for the level of destruction that modern nuclear weapons can cause. A big city like New York or Moscow or London would not be hit with one 15 kiloton warhead. It would be hit with 10 or 15 or 20 weapons, each of which would be 30 to 50 times more powerful. And we can conceptualize that with a model of a single large 20 megaton explosion. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction, 4 miles across. Within this entire area, temperatures would rise to 20 million degrees, hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, gasoline, heating oil, plastic, wood, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next 30 minutes would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, we're talking about 12 to 15 million people dead in half an hour. And if this were part of a full war between the United States and Russia, this level of destruction would be visited on every major city in both countries. And if NATO were drawn into the conflict, every major city in Canada and Europe as well. 300 to 500 million people dead in an afternoon. But again, these direct effects are only part of the story. The soot lofted into the atmosphere by a war of this magnitude would essentially create a new ice age. Temperatures across the planet would drop an average of 14 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. For 3 years, there would not be a single day in the Northern Hemisphere where the temperature did not fall below freezing for some point. And under these conditions, all of the ecosystems which have evolved in the 15,000 years since the end of the last ice age would collapse, food production would stop, and the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. Now, this is not the scenario for a grade B movie. This is the danger we are living with every single day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. But this is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. It is not like there's an asteroid coming at us from outer space. These are little machines. They're smaller than the desk I'm sitting at talking to you. We have built them with our own hands and we know how to take them apart. All that's missing is the political will. Internationally, nations have come together to form the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And at this point, 44 countries have ratified this treaty. When the 50th country ratifies it later this month or next month, the treaty will have legal force. Here in the United States, we have launched a campaign called Back from the Brink to bring about the fundamental change in US nuclear policy needed to prevent this catastrophe. The most important part of this program is a call for the United States to enter now into negotiations with all the other nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to dismantle the remaining nuclear weapons. We can do this. It is an enormous task, but we can do it. In the 1980s, we brought about in less than 4 years a complete transformation of the political landscape with regards to nuclear weapons. During the Cold War, we were headed towards a nuclear apocalypse, and millions of people took action, and we stopped that. We stopped the Cold War arms race, and we saved the world. We have to do it again. I urge all of you to join the Back from the Brink campaign. You can visit our website, preventnuclearwar.org, that's one word, and find out how you can join individually, and more importantly, how you can bring your community into this. The church groups you belong to, the civic groups you belong to, the city or town councils in the municipalities where you live. And if enough of us endorse this approach, we can bring about a new consensus of what US nuclear policy should be, and we can force our political leadership to address this issue and to take action. We have before us today a very stark choice. You're either going to end nuclear weapons or they're going to end us. And we have to take this seriously. We are living on borrowed time. Our luck will run out if we don't take action, but we can take action. The choice is up to us. And if we do the right things, we can eliminate nuclear weapons. And as we did in the 1980s, we can save the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Helfand, and thank you so much for that comprehensive assessment. There will be questions, I'm sure, addressed to each of you, and I'd just like to send a reminder. I'm sure Brennan had already mentioned this. If you have questions to our speakers, please feel free to submit them in the chat section on your screen. We will try to get to as many as possible, and if you could also specify who you're addressing your question to, that would be really helpful as well. So next we're going to turn to Dr. Michael Klare. He is the Professor Emeritus of Peace and World Security Studies at Hampshire College and a Senior Visiting Fellow at the Arms Control Association in Washington, D.C., where he studies emerging weapons technologies. He is the author of 15 books, including most recently, All Hell Breaking Loose, The Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. Today, Dr. Klare will speak about the new Cold War that is emerging between the US and China and how that affects both the struggle to overcome climate change and efforts to slow down the nuclear arms race. Dr. Klare.
Oh, well, I'm still gasping for breath after hearing my colleagues before me talking about the challenges we face. And I'm going to add to that. So we have a lot more ahead for all of us to talk about. And I'm honored to be with such distinguished company here this evening. I was originally going to speak about the connections between these two topics, the threat of climate change that Marty Nathan presented so eloquently, and the threat of nuclear annihilation that Dr. Helfand presented with equal eloquence. I do believe that there is a close connection between the two. Marty alluded to that earlier. I think that climate change is going to increase the risk of nuclear war by making certain critical resources, especially water, increasingly scarce, particularly among countries that share water supplies, rivers, like the Indus River shared by India and Pakistan, and the Brahmaputra River shared by India and China, leading them to aggravate the conflicts they already have and possibly leading to nuclear war. I also think that the nuclear arms race, as Marty indicated, is scooping up money that could be used for addressing the climate threat. And this is what I was going to speak on. And of course, I could come back to that later. But I want to talk about something else that's come to preoccupy my attention because I feel it's so important. And that is the onset of a new Cold War between the US and China. A Cold War that has a very real potential of becoming a hot war, even a nuclear war, and could occur very rapidly. It could happen, in fact, the onset of war between our two countries could happen momentarily, with warships and warplanes of both countries now circling each other in the South China Sea and in waters off Taiwan. There's very little preventing them, except for the discipline of their officers, to prevent some hothead on either side from pulling a trigger and starting a crisis that could erupt into World War III. And I'm talking about right now. So in my mind, I need to address the dimensions of this new Cold War. In my time, I intend to make three main points, and even if I don't get to elaborate at great length on all of them, let me just state the points that I want to make. First, this is not just an intensification of long-term trends. This is a tipping point from one state of affairs to another. We have gone from a condition of friendly competition with China to one of near war with China. In my mind, this is a profound shift that affects everything. And so, secondly, this shift, the onset of a new Cold War, will, in my mind, overhang everything. Some of you listening may remember what the Cold War was like. I grew up in that period, and others may remember the nuclear war drills we had to go through and the fears of nuclear Armageddon that Ira Helfand referred to. Those fears have dissipated in the past few decades, but a Cold War affects everything. And that's, I want to talk about that. And most of all, it's going to affect climate change, or the chance of addressing climate change. And it's going to affect the chance, of course, of doing what Ira has called upon us to do, to eliminate nuclear weapons. And third, the third point I will make is that it follows from this that henceforth, all of our efforts have to be accompanied by a campaign to end this new Cold War and to prevent war between US and China, and to move towards reconciliation between our two countries so that we can make progress on those other issues. And I know this is a lot, but let me try to make my argument in the time that I have. So first, this is a tipping point, not a continuation of previous trends. Yes, relations between the US and China have been turning sour for a while, from the Obama period with the pivot to the Pacific and China's militarization of islands in the South China Sea. But as recently as 2 years ago, when I was still teaching at the 5 colleges, I could invite Chinese scholars to come and lecture here in the Valley. And I could likewise, and my colleagues likewise, could be invited to go to China easily without any to-do to lecture at Chinese universities and institutions. If you were a tech engineer, if you were a bioscientist, you could have Chinese, your Chinese colleagues come and work in your laboratory, and you could work in China. If you were a tech entrepreneur, you could form collaborations with Chinese companies. If you were a member of Congress seeking to reduce the arms spending that Marty told us we need to do, you could find allies without having to hear about the threat of Chinese military affairs. And if you were trying to reduce nuclear weapons, you could do so without hearing about China's nuclear arsenal. That was as recently as 2 years ago. None of those things are possible anymore, and I don't believe they're going to be possible even if there's a Biden presidency. So we are in a situation that's radically different. What worries me most is the change in the military reality. 2 years ago, we were worrying about wars in the Middle East and maybe Russian aggression in Ukraine. The military then was focused on containing those problems. Today, the situation is radically different. The US military is doing one thing only, and that's preparing for a war with China and asking Congress to devote hundreds of billions of dollars in additional money for advanced weapons to defeat China in a new world war. And if you look at what they're asking money for in the nuclear realm, it's so that we could fight a war with China. Russia's been pushed aside off the agenda. Everything is about fighting and defeating China in war. That's all they talk about. So, and it's also on the battlefield. As I say, right now, there are 2 aircraft carrier battle groups, one led by the USS Nimitz, the other by the USS Ronald Reagan, that is circling off the coast or in the vicinity of China with cruisers and aircraft and destroyers and submarines, accompanied by nuclear capable B-1s, B-2s, and B-52s at this moment in a threatening posture to intimidate China and push back its geopolitical interests. But China is doing the same thing. It's militarizing those bases and trying to intimidate Taiwan. Both sides are engaging in this posturing, this muscle flexing that are making conditions in that area increasingly hazardous. And a small incident, the way these forces are designed, an incident could explode from a small incident to a larger conflict overnight, and from there to a larger war, and from there to a nuclear war. So this atmosphere is going to, like I say, affect everything. It's going to make it impossible to address the climate change issue. If you recall, how did we get to the Paris Climate Agreement? That's because President Obama pleaded with President Xi Jinping of China to join him in a partnership to persuade other countries, especially India, to join in that agreement. Without that partnership, the Paris Climate Agreement would never have occurred. Now, without that kind of cooperation, further progress on climate change is impossible at the international level. And remember, China and the US together produce almost half of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. So unless those two countries cooperate, dealing with the climate problem is going to become increasingly impossible. And on the matters that Ira so eloquently spoke about of reducing nuclear arsenals and eliminating nuclear weapons, this can only occur with China's and US working together. I'd love to talk about the START treaty, spend just 1 minute on that. The last remaining nuclear agreement between the US and Russia, the New START or New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, is about to expire in February. It was that reduced about half of the remaining nuclear weapons then in existence. That will expire in February unless both countries, US and Russia, agree to continue it. The Trump administration says we're not going to renew that agreement unless China joins in. And China says it won't join in because it has such a tiny arsenal compared to the others. That's a ridiculous idea. So the US is using China as an excuse to destroy that remaining treaty and to justify the reignition of the US-Russian arms race. So you see how the issues that matter to us so much require that we address this Cold War as part of the other things that we do. I would like to say more about what it will take to organize a campaign to oppose this trend towards a Cold War with China. This is something we're going to have to give a lot of thought to in the future. And by the way, the Democratic leadership, including people around Joe Biden, are just as enthusiastic about this as most of the Republicans are. So we're going to have to work very hard to win over a Biden presidency, if we're so fortunate for that to occur, to persuade that presidency that a Cold War with China is the worst thing for America, that he'll never be able to achieve his climate goals and all his other goals if he goes down that path. But that is the work that we have ahead of us. And I hope in the question and answer period, I could speak more about what it will take to build that kind of a campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klare, for that very bleak assessment of US-China relations and implications for cooperation on so many other fronts, especially the nuclear arms race and also climate change. I will now turn to Dr. Laura Reed, who is a political scientist at UMass Amherst. She's a longtime peace activist and security expert with a PhD from MIT. Her research explores promising strategies to reduce the threats posed by nuclear, biological, chemical, and radiological weapons. She is currently teaching an honors thesis seminar called Bioterrorism: Interdisciplinary Perspectives at UMass Amherst. Dr. Reed is going to discuss the similarities and differences between the climate emergency and the threat posed by nuclear weapons, making the case that it is vital to distinguish the interests and forces underpinning each. Before I invite her to start speaking, I should point, perhaps Brennan did at the beginning, that she is nursing an injured wrist, and despite being in considerable discomfort, was very gracious and has joined this discussion. However, she will not be able to participate in the Q&A session later, but we're so grateful for her time for now.
Well, thank you so much. I am so pleased to be a part of this discussion. And I am so relieved because the three previous speakers have done such a superb job of touching upon so many of the fundamental issues that I had wanted to address, but now I don't need to. So what I am going to do is I work with undergraduates. I spend a lot of time with young people trying to engage them. And as you mentioned, I deal with various threats and dangers posed by weapons of mass destruction. Each is different. But what I am hoping, my big pitch, is to discuss the urgency of addressing these problems, but to frame it in terms of thinking about it as dual existential threats. So whenever we talk about the existential threat of climate change, I want that to be hand in hand with the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. And my takeaway about this is that what you see is there has been much greater awareness and mobilization among young people throughout this country, with rising awareness and activism surrounding trying to tackle and address climate change. Unfortunately, and I think as Dr. Helfand had shown, we don't see that comparable amount of attention and mobilization. So what I want to do is just briefly make the pitch whenever you're talking and thinking and engaging and calling upon our government and citizens to act and to address climate change, that you also put hand in hand the threat and the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. And in both cases, it is key to also discuss the profoundly powerful entrenched interests in terms of climate change. As you're no doubt aware, you have the fossil fuel industry, and we really do have to confront the fact that it's not just subsidized, it's making ridiculous amounts of money, has enormous resources. And if you really delve into some of these issues, you see that obviously they're different parties, but they'll stop at almost nothing to suppress, deny, and delay efforts to tackle the threats posed by climate change and transition to clean and renewable energies and to reduce our addiction to fossil fuels. So that's something that I think is important, and people are beginning to recognize that and play it out. So you really have to identify and name these powerful interests, see how it plays out. And of course, we should focus on the fires, the melting, the vulnerable populations, all of those pieces, but hand in hand, linking it to those powerful interests. And at the same time, though, I think I want to say, I keep saying, yes, this is a connection, but the one piece about nuclear weapons that is fundamentally different is in terms of where are the vested interests and those powerful forces. So nuclear weapons are obviously distinguished in terms of being a part of the military and state programs and state controlled. So that is a big difference. So I just want to spend a few minutes identifying that, because it's often taboo, and this is not on the agenda, especially in the United States, when we're looking at military budgets and spending, and that this is kind of a key piece that, of course, you have the Department of Energy, but that this is all in tandem with the US military. So what I would like to just briefly focus on and not spend too much time, because I think we have such a fascinating group and I really want to get the Q&A going. But to first sort of talk about the fact that, okay, what's going on with the US nuclear arsenal? And I think that you've heard already in terms of the dangers, the risks, the threats, but let's just call out some of the numbers and identify this. So right now, the US nuclear arsenal has remained roughly unchanged over the past year. You have the Defense Department maintaining a stockpile of approximately 3,800 nuclear warheads. And of those total warheads in the stockpile, you have 1,750 nuclear warheads that are deployed, 1,750. I want to just run through this because I'm going to then go on and talk about the land-based part of the force. But what you see is, of the approximately 1,750 warheads that are now deployed in the United States, you have 400 that are land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. And that is a key piece on active alert. And as people are talking about the planned $1 trillion nuclear modernization programs that are planned by and approved by Congress moving forward, this is something that is just enormously costly, redundant, dangerous. And it was developed, the land-based forces, in a very different era with different concerns about vulnerabilities. So I want to very quickly stress as we think about this, that there is an enormous amount of money going into it. They don't serve any purpose. The military has even identified this as not being needed. So this is a piece that, as we're looking at different ways of tackling these issues and really thinking about this profound threat, that we take one step, one piece, and the other speakers have identified so many important points. And especially, I think Ira talking about Back from the Brink campaign, that is such a key, crucial piece to engage in. But just as we think about it, if we are really trying to make progress and tackle climate change, as you know, to really transition, it's going to take a fundamental change in our way of life. It's going to take enormous amounts of money and focus. So if I could make a plea, and I love my environmental activists, but if they could just link that with the wasteful and dangerous spending that we are now currently today and moving forward, putting into modernizing and maintaining nuclear forces, this is a key piece that I think will help people, that not just is it an existential threat, but the key thing getting in the way of transitioning are the enormous costs, and especially in this terrible pandemic and the financial crisis that we are now in, budgets are going to be tight. So taking that one piece of looking at the hundreds of billions of dollars that we are spending every year, that it siphons away from money that can be used for a lot of other basic fundamental needs and important issues, from healthcare and tackling climate change on out. And so if I could make a plea, that would be that, see it as, to successfully fight these issues, that you have, on the one hand, I want to make the connection, the linkage. On the other hand, I'm saying it's actually quite promising, because you have, because it's state controlled in the United States, you can target and pressure citizens and engage with Congress in terms of taking on these costs. And especially, I won't even try, Michael Klare has tackled the dangers of Cold War conventional forces, but this is just one piece that I think could go a long way to, as others have mentioned, make us safer and move toward a world free of nuclear weapons, but also to try to tackle the key need to really put in a lot of money toward making the transition. So on that note, I just want to mention there are many, many groups working on this, but there is, if anyone is interested, I really encourage people to look at the big picture and the Back from the Brink and the Global Zero and the international campaign. There are many different campaigns, but if I could say one point that I think we really could push on and make very clear progress, and this, you see, young people get this in terms of they aren't caught in that Cold War mindset of the importance and sort of role of nuclear weapons. So it's right today, tell your members of Congress or other state representatives to stop funding unnecessary and dangerous land-based ICBMs. We should prohibit any possibility of testing. Of course, that's a no-brainer, but we really need to rein this in. This is one part of a larger puzzle, and you can get widespread agreement. And again, linking it to climate change, but the land-based missiles, if you really get into all the nuclear strategy and risks, are incredibly threatening and undermine our security in a big ways. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for that. And thank you for also directing our attention to actionable things that we can do in terms of calling our members of Congress. Before we open it up for discussion and before we start taking questions, I would like to invite the other three panelists to maybe respond very briefly to what Dr. Reed has mentioned in terms of vested interests, reprioritizing our funding mechanisms. If you would like to just briefly touch on that, anybody can go ahead. We will after that open it up for Q&A, because Dr. Reed then does have to go. And if not, we can then continue. with questions from the audience. And let me turn to you, Dr. Nathan. There's been a lot of discussion about things that need to happen. And one of the questions that came up with respect to both nuclear disarmament and the climate emergency is that both nuclear disaster and climate disasters will destroy the planet and all its living inhabitants, says one questioner. What are the international political collaborations that could most effectively prevent either one? What are you seeing on the international stage, the collaborations between countries, between NGOs, between the international civil society?
Well, right now I see nothing because the Trump administration is not willing to deal with climate change or with many of the countries who are interested in lowering emissions. I think, though, the Paris Climate Change Agreement has said that, as did Laura say that, or Michael said that, yes, that we have the possibility, if we actually approach it in an open and generous manner, we have the possibility of working with China, possibly with the Soviet Union, although for me that's less likely. I'm sorry, Russia, and definitely with the European Union and India. But nothing is going to happen at all until we actively remove this hell-bent administration, hell-bent on destruction administration.
What are some signs? Yes, please go ahead, Dr.
I was just going to comment on the nuclear side. There is a little bit more positive to report in terms of international cooperation, and that focuses on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted by a vote of 122 to 1 at the UN in July of 2017. That treaty prohibits the possession of nuclear weapons, and the vote to adopt it represented a huge statement by the international community that the current status quo was not acceptable, that the 9 nations which have nuclear weapons can no longer hold the rest of the world hostage, and their own people hostage as well, and that something fundamental needs to change. To enter into force, 50 nations need to ratify that treaty. We've gotten to 44 ratifications. And as I mentioned quickly in my remarks, we are expecting the final 6 ratifications to take place sometime over the next couple of months. The treaty technically enters into force 90 days after the 50th ratification. This treaty was brought about in large measure by civil society. There were a number of non-nuclear armed states that played a tremendous role in it, but it was the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons that really moved this treaty forward. And this is a campaign that involves over 500 NGOs in more than 100 countries around the world. And I think it's a really inspiring demonstration of the power that civil society can have in bringing about a real change in the world. Our strategy was to focus on what we call the humanitarian impact of nuclear war, what the docs call the medical consequences. And we were able to change the conversation completely away from a discussion of military strategy, nuclear game theory, all the kinds of things that had dominated the conversation for decades and led to no action, to a focus on what these weapons are actually going to do if they're used. And that really changed everything. Now, the problem with this whole process is that the nuclear armed states, including the United States, have not participated. And so the next step in this process has got to be creating political will within the 9 nuclear armed states to change their nuclear policies. And that's what leads to the Back from the Brink campaign here in the United States.
And Dr. Helfand, how encouraged are you by the Biden campaign's agenda on this? Have you seen some progress? Do you feel that if we have that administration, the US will, move to sign and then ratify it?
No, I think that's not in the cards initially, at least. The Biden administration has taken a number of positions. They oppose testing. They have said, putative Biden administration, they have said that they would favor an extension of New START. But we have our work cut out. Biden and the people around him have not committed to the abolition of nuclear weapons as a US strategic goal. And we're going to have to do a lot of work to move the Biden administration, if we get one, to this position as well. One of the fears I have had is that, with all the other problems that this administration will have to face, and they are real and pressing, that nuclear weapons will get pushed to the back burner. And the climate change may get pushed to the back burner as well. And we simply cannot afford that. We have got to bring these issues to the fore. The United States needs to see the elimination of nuclear weapons as its most urgent national security goal. And the current group around Biden does not share that assessment yet, but I'm hopeful that we can bring about that change in their thinking.
Great, thank you. Another question, this is directed to Dr. Klare. You mentioned the new Cold War between the US and China, but recently there have been huge tensions at the border between India and China. And our audience wants to know if you feel that that could lead to a potential for nuclear conflict.
Oh, thank you for that question. This is a very important issue. Now, I alluded to tension between India and China, talking about disputes that existed over time. There's a border dispute between them, a long contested border, and this straddles the Brahmaputra River, which is crucial to both countries. So I spoke of that in respect to climate change earlier. But these border disputes have heated up in the past few months. I believe that both sides in this dispute have been emboldened to act because of US interference. That's my view. That is to say, the US has been nudging India to move from being kind of a neutral party in the US-China emerging Cold War, to being a US ally against China by providing India with weapons, very sophisticated weapons, and by de facto accepting India's status as a nuclear weapons party, not officially perhaps, but essentially accepting India's nuclear status and encouraging India to take a more aggressive stance towards China. And this in turn, I think, has made China feel more threatened, more anxious, and more inclined, therefore, to take a tough stance on the border with India. Could this lead to a nuclear conflict? I don't think right away. I don't think either India or China wants to get involved in a major conflict between them, but it certainly could lead in that direction, and I blame the United States for this.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Klare. Marty, let me just turn to you. Dr. Helfand mentioned the nuclear weapons ban treaty, right? So that there was a recent article in Foreign Policy that suggested that climate justice activists could draw lessons from the nuclear disarmament movement. And the way to do that, they suggested, is to come up with, sort of develop really strong prohibitive norms, global norms, and even by circumventing some of the worst offenders, right? Because when you include the worst offenders in trying to develop treaties or consensus around these issues, you come up with very watered down treaties. And the way the nuclear ban treaty came into place was circumventing the veto players and sort of coming up with this treaty that brought about, based on moral and humanitarian grounds, these very strong norms globally. How would you respond to that? And do you think that that is something that climate activists could also do in the future?
I really haven't thought of this before, and it's a very interesting idea. I think that there are differences in how the two existential threats manifest in our world. And one of the issues of climate change is that it's rapidly advancing, and we watch it advance, and we have a limited amount of time to act. And so we have to really figure out where we can focus that will get the most done quickly. And to do that, you need to look at the major emitters and see if you can cut emissions quickly, which would mean a treaty. If we can get the United States, if we can get a government that is friendly to cutting emissions in the United States, and then work with China, the EU, and India, I guess to me that makes more sense. Mm-hmm. And we also have, there are globally, there are climate activists in all of those countries who are also working on those things already. I'm not sure about the way forward that you suggest, because as happened with the nuclear treaty, the nuclear armed states still haven't signed it.
Right.
So in our case, where we need to stop emissions right now, okay, in the United States and China and the European Union, we can't wait for the rest of the world, and they won't cut emissions before the major emitters do. So I'm not sure, I haven't thought about this very much, but I'm not sure that it applies.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. And sort of following up on that, we do have another question, Dr. Helfand. And this says, aren't our current approaches to nuclear arms control just feel-good measures that merely tweak policies that have essentially failed to attain the desired results of disarmament of the bad actor / renegade nation? So sort of what Dr. Nathan was just saying. Oh, you have your mute buttons on.
Sorry, absolutely. The efforts of at nuclear arms control over the last 20, 30 years have all been on the periphery, nibbling at the edges and just sort of, nicely phrased, trying to make people feel good that we're doing something. We need to have a very fundamental change in that. And we don't have much time to bring that about. The sense of urgency that Marty very correctly brings to the climate issue should also be felt with the nuclear issue. We are living on borrowed time at this point. We have been unbelievably lucky in avoiding a nuclear war so far. And there's really no reason to expect this luck is going to continue indefinitely. We've got to make fundamental change quickly. I think here in the United States, we have two parallel and quite comparable programs. The Green New Deal, I think, is the way forward on climate. And it's something that we can do here in the United States. Whether our government negotiates a treaty with other countries or not, we can take the steps here in the United States to bring about major reductions in carbon emissions here in the US and provide an example and lead the way. And back from the brink, which I view as sort of the Green New Deal for the nuclear weapons problem, which can rally people to bring about not these cosmetic changes around the edges of the nuclear problem, but real fundamental change. The US nuclear posture remains today that our security is best served by maintaining a large nuclear arsenal. This is fundamentally wrong. And we need to have a different paradigm. We need to have the idea that our security requires not that we maintain a nuclear arsenal, but that we eliminate all nuclear weapons across the planet. And to do that, we have to be willing to give up our own arsenal. But that's fine, because if we can induce the other countries to join with us in that effort, we don't need nuclear weapons. And so that kind of fundamental change on both the climate and the nuclear front is really what is necessary. And the coming decade is a make or break. You know, we can't afford to have a good presidency in the next 4 years. We need a great presidency. And that means that the next president of the United States needs to be able to fundamentally address the climate issue and bring about real change. And they need to take fundamental steps to get rid of nuclear weapons. For all the other problems that we're facing, we need to deal with those too. But I will tell you, 1,000 years from now, if we have people living on this planet, the only thing we're going to care about is whether we stop climate change, prevented nuclear war.
Thank you, Dr. Helfand. Dr. Klare, would you like to add to that?
I would like to say something, please. And this is a friendly discussion I have with my colleague, Ira Helfand, and I should say due acknowledgement, I'm on the board of the Arms Control Association. So I think there has to be two strategies. There has to be the kind of grassroots mass campaign that Ira speaks of so eloquently, so persuasively, to abolish all nuclear weapons. And at the same time, we have to work with friendly members of Congress, and I speak of our own representative here in Northampton, Jim McGovern, and our Senator Ed Markey, who is facing a challenge coming in the coming primary. I guess we can't talk too much about that, but these are people who, and there are others in Congress who are doing everything they can to reduce the risk of nuclear war where they can, by cutting funding for nuclear weapons, for pushing for the extension of the New START treaty, for doing everything they possibly can within the political context we have today with Trump in office to reduce the threat of nuclear war. So I think both strategies are essential and legitimate to do what we can in the current political milieu in Washington with allies that we have, and at the same time to organize the grassroots campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. They both have to go on simultaneously.
Thank you, Dr. Klare. Yes, there are indeed multiple pathways to this end that we're all trying to achieve. Dr. Klare, I would like to ask, and this is a question from the audience, if Joe Biden is elected, can the US reinstate the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia? What about the nuclear deal with Iran? Also, what about New START in 2021? And sort of related to that is, can the president extend START without the Senate?
Thank you. Oh, those are all good, very good questions. Thank you for whoever submitted them. Yes, the New START treaty can be extended without further addressing the Senate. It's written into the original treaty that all it requires is the approval of the two presidents on each side, the Russian and the American president. And as Ira has indicated, Biden has said that he would approve the extension, 5-year extension of New START. And the Russian president, Mr. Putin, has said that he would do so as well. So there's that. On the INF treaty, I do not know whether Biden has said explicitly that he would continue it, would reinstate it, but I think that it's possible for him to do so. He could not do that, however, unless he first tackles the issue of the China threat, because the US broke the treaty with Russia, not to fight Russia, but to fight China, to install weapons in the Pacific that would be able to attack Chinese bases on the mainland. And the Army is already testing these weapons, and the Air Force and the Navy testing INF prohibited weapons already, so that they could quickly start preparing for the war with China. So he would have to, before he could move in that direction, Biden would have to start a new process of negotiations with China to create a new environment of peace with China, and that could follow. And I do believe that the Biden camp is committed to reinstating the joint comprehensive plan of action with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal. So these are good reasons to support a Biden candidacy. Thank you for that question.
Yes, that came from multiple audience members. So that was a collection of questions from different people. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Klare. I am so grateful for all of our panelists and their amazing and very, very deep analysis of the very existential threats that we currently face. I know our audience members would also be interested in actionable steps that can be taken and the different campaigns that were mentioned, both at the grassroots level and the way people can engage with their members of Congress. I am going to end it here only because we've already had 2 rounds of questions with our speakers, but I will turn it over to Brennan, who will give our closing remarks and also then take it back to our speakers for closing comments. So thank you all so much for joining us. Over to you, Brennan.
Great, and thanks, Malaka, so much for facilitating this great discussion. And thank you to all of our panelists again for sharing your thoughts on these pressing issues and also ways to address these issues. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. I'm happy to report we've had viewers from Japan, Denmark, Canada, and elsewhere across the United States. So thank you everyone for joining. And just to close out this event, I'd like to go through each of our panelists one more time and just kind of give some final closing thoughts and particularly sort of actionable steps that people can be taking with them from this event to address these pressing issues. So we'll start with you, Marty. Great.
I'm saying nothing new by saying that the upcoming election is the most important in our lifetime. And for me, the most important thing that I am looking for when looking to vote is searching for candidates who support a way out of the climate emergency. It would be wonderful if they support the Green New Deal or originated the Green New Deal even. I think that what has been emphasized over and over again tonight, though, is that there are 2 existential threats and we must fight. We must have a new anti-nuclear war, anti-Cold War movement that should be allied with the climate action movement. There's local work to be done. Get in touch with me for around climate change. I'm glad to talk to you about how you can plug in regionally.
And over to you now, Ira, sorry.
Thanks, Brennan. This has been a fairly heavy evening. We've been talking about some very disturbing, scary, frightening stuff. And everything that's been said about the danger we face is true, but I think we must be careful not to be overwhelmed by the danger we face, because this is a danger which we can deal with. I personally am not a particularly pessimistic person. I think that we can prevent climate change, and I think that we can eliminate nuclear weapons. And these are enormous challenges, which I hope, especially young people, will take up and take them up in the spirit of really the challenge of a lifetime. We all want to do good things with our lives. And those of us who are working to prevent climate change and to prevent nuclear war literally have the opportunity to save the world. And there's absolutely nothing better that anyone can ever do with their life. Specifically, I would urge people on the nuclear weapons side to join the Back from the Brink campaign. Visit our website, preventnuclearwar.org, or get in touch with me locally here or others in our local PSR chapter. We do, just to clear something up, I totally agree with what Michael said about the need to work on the interim steps as well. The Back from the Brink campaign calls for the US to get its weapons off hair trigger alert, to end the first use policy, which we now have, to end the situation where the President of the United States can launch nuclear war without anybody else having a say in the matter, and to stop the plan to spend over $1 trillion to modernize our nuclear forces. But it really focuses on the urgent need to get rid of these weapons and to make that fundamental change. And I would invite everyone who's not already involved to get involved with this campaign. Thank you.
And I guess it's up to me to finish, and it's hard to add anything to what's been said by our astounding panelists. And I wish Laura Reed were here. Maybe she's listening in, but I think each of you contributed enormously to this discussion. So I want to thank Meklana for your contribution in helping make this thing go successful. and for Brennan, for you for organizing this and also for making it so successful. So maybe I could speak for all the panelists in thanking you both for doing such a wonderful job, and second the words that Ira just said about and Marty said, the importance of this election and the need for us to carry forth. So I'll end with that.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. And again, thank you to all our viewers for tuning in. We will be sending out a recording of this event to everyone who registered, and it will be available on YouTube to share in your network. So please help us in spreading the word on this important conversation. And have a great night, and thank you again.
Brennan, bye-bye.
Night.